When the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, no one realized the world had just changed forever. There were no explosions, no grand wars, no last emperor standing in defiance. Rome didn't collapse with a roar. It quietly shut down. The empire that had ruled for centuries simply faded, and with it, so did something far greater: memory. What followed is what we now call the Dark Ages, 1,000 years of history that almost feels missing. It's strange when you think about it. How can a civilization that built aqueducts, advanced architecture, and complex governments suddenly stop progressing? How does a continent that once gave birth to philosophy, science, and engineering suddenly forget everything for nearly a millennium? You open the history books, and after Rome, there's a gap. No grand inventions, no major discoveries, no voices that shaped the world, just fragments, scattered records, vague stories, and the echo of a civilization that once led humanity. Historians say the fall of Rome triggered chaos, invasions, plagues, ignorance, but even chaos leaves traces, ruins, writings, records. The Dark Ages left almost nothing. It's as if someone pressed delete on an entire chapter of human history. The few documents that survived were copied and translated by monks inside stone monasteries. Candles burned, ink dried, and the last remaining knowledge of the ancient world was rewritten under religious authority. The Church had become the keeper of the past, deciding what knowledge would live on and what would vanish forever. And maybe that's where the darkness truly began. Not outside, but within. Because when one institution controls knowledge, it also controls truth. What people learn, what they believe, what they forget. Meanwhile, the rest of the world kept moving. In the East, the Islamic Golden Age was flourishing. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, all advancing faster than ever. In China, inventions like printing and gunpowder were changing history. But in Europe, silence. It doesn't make sense. How could the brightest minds of Rome be followed by almost 1,000 years of nothing? Maybe it wasn't nothing. Maybe it was hidden, rewritten, delayed. Because history isn't just what happened. It's what we're allowed to remember. The Dark Ages might not have been dark at all. Maybe they were just covered, sealed behind closed doors, locked away by those who decided the world wasn't ready to know. 1,000 years, a missing chapter, and a question that still echoes today. Was it really darkness? Or was it erasure? Rome didn't end with a bang. It didn't fall in fire or thunder. There were no grand battles marking its final breath. No desperate emperor making a last stand for glory. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 AD, it was almost quiet, unsettlingly quiet. A young emperor named Romulus Augustulus sat on a throne that had already lost its power. He was barely a teenager when a Germanic general named Odoacer entered the city and demanded his crown. No one fought back. No one rallied to defend the empire that had once ruled the known world. Romulus simply stepped aside, handed over the imperial insignia, and walked away. That was it. The Roman Empire, the greatest civilization of its age, was gone. No funeral, no ceremony, no echo. Just silence. But the strangest part wasn't how it ended. It was how the world reacted. No one seemed to notice. For centuries, Rome had been the heartbeat of the Western world. Its laws, its roads, its armies had connected millions of people. Yet when that heart stopped beating, life somehow went on. Farmers still worked their fields. Markets still opened. Local leaders replaced senators. It's as if the collapse of an empire didn't shake the world at all, just its memory. Historians later wrote of this moment as the fall of Rome. But to those living through it, there was no fall, only change. The marble walls remained, the statues still stood, the road still stretched across Europe. Rome didn't vanish overnight. It slowly crumbled, piece by piece, until no one remembered what it had once been. And that's where history begins to blur. For the next few centuries, records grow scarce. Documents disappear. Great events that should have shaped the continent are missing. We know that kingdoms rose and fell, but the details are gone, like ink washed away by time. Why? Was it because no one cared to write it down? Or because someone hosed to erase it? The silence after Rome's fall was not just the silence of war ending. It was the silence of knowledge fading, libraries burned, schools closed, scholars scattered or joined the church to survive. The flow of information, that powerful engine of progress, stopped almost completely. And from that silence, a new power emerged. The church. It became the keeper of memory, the guardian of what was left. But when one hand controls all the words, history becomes a matter of choice. What to remember, what to forget, what to rewrite. The fall of Rome didn't just mark the end of an empire. It marked the beginning of a new world built on silence, a silence so deep it swallowed centuries, a silence that turned into myth. That quiet collapse, that unspoken ending, was the first shadow of what we now call the Dark Ages. Because history didn't fade in blood or fire. It faded in the stillness after the last page was written, and no one picked up the pen again. When the empires of the old world turned to dust, one power still stood, calm, unbroken, and watching. While kingdoms fell and armies vanished, the church endured. It didn't just survive the collapse of Rome, it absorbed its spirit, its language, even its authority. In a world stripped of order, the church became the one constant, the shepherd of faith, and the scribe of history. Across Europe, the roads built by Roman hands still wound through forests and fields, but the world they once connected was gone. Trade had slowed, cities had emptied, and silence filled the spaces where philosophy once lived. And in that silence, monks worked, quietly, patiently, in stone monasteries that stood like islands in a sea of chaos. By day, they prayed. By night, they wrote. Rows of men in brown robes sat hunched over wooden desks, their faces lit by flickering candlelight. The air smelled of wax and ink. With quills carved from feathers, they copied texts, word by word, line by line, preserving what was left of the ancient world. But not everything survived. Each page they chose to copy was a decision about what the future would remember. Some texts were sacred, the Bible, the words of the Church Fathers. Others, the works of philosophers, scientists, and poets, were considered dangerous, even forbidden. Aristotle survived, but much of Epicurus did not. The writings of Plato, Galen, and Euclid were saved in fragments, often translated, edited, or rewritten to fit the doctrines of faith. Knowledge didn't die in the Dark Ages, it was filtered. And that's where the mystery begins, because when only one hand holds the pen of history, truth becomes a matter of choice. In monasteries from Ireland to Italy, knowledge was rewritten under a new light. Pagan myths became moral lessons, ancient gods were turned into demons, histories of old empires were reinterpreted through theolo. The Church didn't just record the past, it reshaped it, aligning the story of humanity with the story of God. Outside those stone walls, Europe drifted deeper into silence. People no longer read. They listened. The priest became the voice of truth. The written word belonged only to the few who could read Latin, and most of those sat behind monastery walls. The monks believed they were saving civilization, and in many ways they did. Without them, the knowledge of medicine, astronomy, and mathematics might have vanished completely, but by saving it, they also changed it. Ancient wisdom passed through hands that believed faith was greater than fact, and with each translation, each correction, and each omission, the ancient world faded a little more. The Church became the guardian of memory, the last light in an age of shadows. But light can both reveal and conceal. So what was lost in those candle-lit rooms? What ideas were too dangerous to keep alive? And how different might our history look if every book, every theory, every forbidden page had been allowed to survive? For 1,000 years, the past belonged to the monks, the quiet scribes who wrote the story of humanity in ink and prayer. And when they finished their work, they left behind a version of history shaped not by the world that was, but by the world they believed should be. Between the 5th and 9th centuries, history starts to lose its shape. The grand stories of empires and emperors fade away, replaced by a strange quiet. It's as if the world itself fell asleep, and when it woke, whole centuries had passed. For nearly 400 years, the record grows thin. Few inventions, few names, few moments that echo through time. The Europe that once echoed with the sound of Roman legions and philosophers' debates turned into something unrecognizable. Small villages surrounded by endless forests, forgotten roads covered in moss, and people who no longer looked to the stars, but to the church bell. This was the time later called the Dark Ages. But who called it that, and why? When we look back, it's easy to imagine a continent shrouded in ignorance, where superstition ruled and progress stopped. But the truth is more complicated. The darkness wasn't everywhere. It was only in the records, in what was written down, or rather, what wasn't. While Europe seemed frozen, other parts of the world burned brightly. In Baghdad, the House of Wisdom became a beacon of human thought, a place where scholars from every culture gathered to translate and expand on the works of the Greeks, Persians, and Indians. They mapped the stars, measured the earth, and developed the numbers we still use today. In China, the Tang dynasty reached incredible heights. Printing, gunpowder, the compass, and advanced medicine all emerged during this era. Trade flowed along the Silk Road, ideas moved faster than armies, and science thrived under emperors who valued innovation over conquest. And in India, mathematics and astronomy flourished. The concept of zero, the decimal system, and the study of planetary motion advanced far beyond what Europe would rediscover centuries later. The world was alive, just not in Europe. There, the light of progress seemed trapped under a heavy fog. Books were rare. Learning was confined to monasteries. To most people, knowledge became something sacred, distant, something only priests could touch. The language of science and reason had turned to Latin prayers. But was Europe truly lost in darkness, or was it simply being rewritten? Some believe this pause in progress was exaggerated by later historians, especially those of the Renaissance, who wanted to paint their own age as a glorious rebirth. To make the light of their time seem brighter, they cast the centuries before them in shadow. It's possible that the so-called Dark Ages weren't dark at all, just dimly lit. Small sparks of knowledge still burned in Ireland, Byzantium, and Spain. Engineers built cathedrals, farmers invented new tools, and thinkers quietly kept the flame alive, waiting for a time when it could burn openly again. But those stories, the quiet ones, rarely survive. History favors noise, wars, revolutions, discoveries that shout. The soft hum of quiet progress is often lost in the fog. And so, when we look back at those centuries, we see an empty space, as if time itself took a break. But maybe it didn't. Maybe it just moved in silence, beyond the reach of the scribes who would one day call it dark. Because darkness is not always the absence of light. Sometimes, it's what happens when no one is watching the flame. By the 7th century, Europe had grown quiet, not in peace, but in obedience. The fires of ancient debate had burned out, and in their place stood a new kind of power. Silence. It wasn't forced at first. It simply settled in, a slow, creeping stillness that wrapped itself around knowledge like a cloak. Inside monasteries, monks continued their sacred work, copying texts, preserving wisdom, protecting the fragile remnants of Rome's intellectual legacy. But not every word was welcome. Not every idea deserved ink. The old philosophers, those who had once asked dangerous questions about gods, the soul, and the universe, were handled carefully. Their works were translated, filtered, reshaped to fit the growing authority of the Church. Some scrolls were copied and sealed in vaults. Others were quietly burned, deemed unnecessary or heretical. Entire schools of thought, Epicureanism, Stoicism, early science, vanished, not in flames of destruction, but in the quiet decision not to remember. Knowledge didn't disappear, it was edited, and over time, people forgot there was ever more to know. The world outside the monastery walls changed, but slowly. Most people couldn't read. Books were rarer than gold. What little knowledge existed flowed through priests and scholars who spoke a language the common people couldn't understand. Latin became both a bridge and a barrier, the language of God, and the lock on the vault of wisdom. In that silence, a strange transformation took place. Curiosity, once the lifeblood of progress, became dangerous. Asking questions could be seen as doubt. Doubt was sin, and sin had consequences. But perhaps the greatest danger wasn't fear. It was forgetfulness. When no one around you asks questions, you eventually stop asking them yourself. Generations grew up believing the world was exactly as they were told. The earth was fixed. The heavens, perfect. Everything that mattered was already written in holy texts. The human mind, which had once reached for the stars, now bowed to the altar. And this silence, this unspoken agreement not to question, became the strongest weapon of all. You don't have to destroy knowledge to control it. You just have to convince people to stop looking for it. Across the East, science still advanced. Arab astronomers mapped the skies. Mathematicians refined geometry, and doctors studied the body in ways Europe had long forgotten. But in the West, truth became something to protect, not explore. The guardians of knowledge turned into gatekeepers. It's easy to blame them, but in truth, silence can be seductive. It feels safe. It gives order to chaos. It tells you that the answers already exist, that you don't need to search anymore. But that comfort comes at a price. When silence becomes normal, freedom fades without a sound. And that's what happened during Europe's quiet centuries. Not a war against knowledge, but an agreement to stop chasing it. Knowledge didn't vanish. It was sealed away line by line, behind locked doors and whispered prayers. And those who might have broken the silence, the thinkers, the dreamers, grew fewer with each generation. The world didn't forget because it was forced to. It forgot because silence is patient, and over time, it teaches you that asking why is no longer worth it. For centuries, the heavens were mankind's oldest clock, silent, perfect, unchanging. The stars moved in patterns so reliable that entire civilizations built their calendars, harvests, and festivals around them. While kingdoms fell and empires vanished, the constellations remained. They were the one truth that could not be rewritten. But somewhere along the line, the sky stopped matching the story below. As scholars in the early Middle Ages began comparing ancient astronomical records to the heavens above, they noticed something strange. The stars weren't where they were supposed to be. Eclipses described by Roman historians didn't line up with modern calculations. Celestial events dated centuries apart seemed to overlap. It was as if time itself had shifted, as though someone had taken history and quietly rearranged it. To the Church, this was no concern. The calendar was sacred, adjusted only by divine decree. But to astronomers and historians, it was a riddle that refused to stay hidden. One of the earliest clues came from the Julian calendar, introduced by Julius Caesar in 45 BC. It was designed to align with the solar year, but over time it drifted, falling out of sync by about 1 day every 128 years. By the 10th century, the dates of equinoxes and solstices no longer matched the heavens. Easter, which depended on the lunar cycle, began to slip. The Church noticed, of course, but instead of asking why the gap existed, they corrected it centuries later, in 1582, with Pope Gregory XIII's reform. The Gregorian calendar erased 10 entire days to fix the drift. But the correction raised deeper questions. If our timeline had already gone wrong once, how many times before had it been quietly adjusted? And that's where the mystery deepens. In the 1990s, a group of historians and astronomers proposed what became known as the phantom time hypothesis, the idea that, to roughly 300 years of history, from around 614 to 901 AD, might never have happened at all. They argued that astronomical events, architecture, and written records simply didn't line up. Charlemagne, the great emperor of Europe, might have been a legend. The year 800 could have been closer to 500. Mainstream historians dismissed it as speculation, but the theory touched a nerve. Because even if it wasn't true, it asked a haunting question. If the stars don't agree with our calendars, what else might we have rewritten without realizing it? The night sky became more than a mystery. It became a mirror, a silent witness to what time really is, unbothered by human politics, kings, or popes. The constellations didn't care who ruled Earth. They moved to their own rhythm, revealing every lie hidden in the pages of history. You can erase books, burn libraries, and rewrite timelines, but you can't change the sky. Every star is a record, a memory of where we truly stand in time. And if their positions no longer match our stories, then maybe it's not the stars that are wrong. Maybe it's us, because the sky doesn't lie. But history sometimes does. It sounds impossible, almost absurd. But what if part of our history never happened? What if centuries we've been taught to believe in were simply inserted? This is the unsettling question behind what's known as the phantom time hypothesis. The idea that roughly 300 years of human history, somewhere between 614 and 911 AD, might not exist at all. According to this theory, we're not living in the year 2025, but closer to 1725. It began in the 1990s with a German historian named Heribert Illig. While studying medieval records, he noticed something strange. The events, architecture, and astronomical data from that era didn't align. Buildings supposedly built centuries apart looked identical. The same rulers, the same wars, seemed to repeat under different names. Even celestial records, eclipses, comets, and planetary alignments refused to fit where they should. Something was off, and Illig asked the unthinkable, what if those years were never real? According to the theory, Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and even Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII may have conspired to move time forward. Why? To place themselves at the sacred year 1000 AD, a number loaded with prophecy and power. In a world obsessed with divine timelines, reaching the year 1000 meant living in a new age, the dawn of a Christian millennium. If true, It means calendars were deliberately altered, documents forged, chronicles expanded, 3 entire centuries fabricated. Mainstream historians dismiss the theory as fringe speculation, but the coincidences it points to are hard to ignore. Certain architectural styles, like Romanesque, appear centuries before their supposed origin. The archaeological gap between the fall of Rome and the Middle Ages remains suspiciously thin. And then there's Charlemagne, the emperor who united Europe, founded schools, and shaped the continent's identity. His Eigen is described in lavish detail, yet no physical trace of him has ever been found. No tomb, no verified relics, just stories, copied and recopied by monks in a time when rewriting history was as simple as picking up a quill. Could time itself have been edited, not to count the days, but to control the narrative? If so, it changes everything we know about history. The rise of kingdoms, the spread of religions, the turning points we base our understanding of civilization on, all built upon numbers that might not be real. Imagine the power in that, to not only rule the present, but to shape the past. Of course, the phantom time hypothesis remains unproven. Archaeology, radiocarbon dating, and dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, seem to contradict it. Yet the idea lingers because it exposes a deeper truth. History isn't an unbroken record. It's a story, written by those who had the power to decide what counted as time. And if time can be rewritten once, what's to say it hasn't happened again? The thought is terrifying and fascinating, because it means the timeline we live by might not be the truth. It might be a version of the truth. The stars, the stones, the evidence buried in the earth. They all remember what really happened. But as long as we measure time by human hands, we're trusting storytellers, not the universe. Maybe the real question isn't whether phantom centuries exist. Maybe it's how much of history was crafted to make sense of the present. Because if time can be rewritten, so can destiny. In 1929, a group of historians at the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul made a discovery that still defies explanation. Hidden among old scrolls and manuscripts, they found a map, drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis. At first glance, it looked like any early world map, parts of Europe, Africa, and the Americas sketched in ink on gazelle skin. But when experts studied it closer, one detail stopped them cold. The southern edge of the map showed a coastline, detailed, accurate, and unmistakable. It was Antarctica, drawn centuries before the continent was officially discovered. Even stranger, it wasn't covered in ice. According to the Piri Reis map, Antarctica was mapped as a warm, habitable landmass, with rivers, mountains, and valleys visible beneath the ice sheet that covers it today. Modern scientists confirmed that the subglacial features on the map closely match what radar and satellite imaging would only reveal in the 20th century. How could a 16th century sailor have known that? Reis himself left a clue. In his notes written on the map, he claimed it was not his own creation, but a compilation. He said he had drawn it using 20 charts and 8 mappae mundi, including ancient maps from Greek, Arab, and even older sources, some said to date back to the time of Alexander the Great. That claim opened a door to a mystery far bigger than one map. Other early charts, like the Orontius Phineus map of 1531 and the Buach map of 1737, also depicted southern lands long before explorers ever saw them. Each showed coastlines beneath ice, drawn with a precision that should have been impossible before modern navigation and surveying tools. So where did this knowledge come from? Some historians argue it's coincidence, that these cartographers simply guessed at unknown regions. Others believe they had access to ancient maps now lost to history. Charts passed down through civilizations far older than we realize. A forgotten culture of navigators who once mapped the globe long before recorded history began. And then there's the question no one seems eager to answer. Where are those source maps now? Many of Piri Reis's originals are said to have come from the Imperial Library of Constantinople, which fell to the Ottomans in 1453. But older legends trace them even further, to collections hidden beneath the Vatican, in what's now called the Vatican Apostolic Archive. Beneath St. Peter's Basilica lies nearly 50 miles of shelves, holding documents so old that most have never been read by modern eyes. Some say among them are the lost maps, fragments of pre-Christian geography, accounts of vanished lands, and evidence of civilizations erased from official history. The Vatican has never confirmed it. They simply call it classified material. Could the Church have preserved knowledge that predates even Rome itself? And if so, what does that say about how much of our past has been hidden, locked away under sacred secrecy? The Piri Reis map is more than ink on parchment. It's a challenge, a riddle that asks whether our version of history is complete. Because if a 16th century sailor could draw the world as it truly looks beneath the ice, then someone, somewhere, knew the Earth far better, far earlier than we ever imagined. And maybe in those silent vaults beneath the Vatican, the answers are still waiting, maps of a world we were never meant to remember. We call it the Dark Ages, a time when knowledge vanished and progress froze. But what if that story isn't entirely true? What if, buried beneath the ruins and dust of history, there were sparks of brilliance that never fit the timeline? Archaeologists have found artifacts that shouldn't exist, gears, instruments, and mechanical devices so advanced they seem to belong centuries ahead of their time. These aren't myths or exaggerations. They're real objects that challenge the very idea that humanity once forgot how to think. Take the Antikythera mechanism, discovered off the coast of Greece in 1901. At first it looked like a lump of corroded metal pulled from an ancient shipwreck, but once cleaned and studied, scientists realized what they were holding: a machine with gears so precise it could predict eclipses, chart planetary positions, and track the 4-year cycle of the Olympic Games. A computer built over 2,000 years ago. Its design was so complex that similar technology wouldn't reappear until medieval clockmakers, more than 1,000 years later. But here's the catch. No one knows who made it, or how. No records, no diagrams, just a single device, proof that somewhere in the ancient world, someone had mastered a science we thought didn't exist until the Renaissance. And it's not alone. In Viking settlements, archaeologists found navigation stones, crystals capable of polarizing light, allowing sailors to find the sun even through thick clouds. In Baghdad, centuries before Europe's awakening, scientists built batteries, clay jars that could generate electric current. Ancient India had surgical instruments of remarkable precision. Chinese engineers built seismographs and multi-gear clocks centuries before the West even imagined them. These discoveries shouldn't fit in the so-called Dark Ages, yet they do. They sit quietly in museums, rarely discussed. Said, each one a small rebellion against the idea that humanity stopped thinking for 1,000 years. So, what happened? If knowledge existed, why was it forgotten? Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was simply hidden, controlled, or left unrecorded. The Church preserved religious knowledge, but saw little value in mechanical invention. Science that couldn't serve faith was often ignored, or worse, destroyed. And when the few who understood such secrets vanished, their discoveries vanished with them. But not everything disappeared. Small workshops in Byzantium, monasteries in Ireland, even alchemists in the heart of medieval Europe. They all kept pieces of the puzzle alive. Quietly, they studied gears, stars, and motion, passing ideas through coded manuscripts and whispered teachings. Knowledge didn't die. It went underground. When the Renaissance finally arrived, the world called it a rebirth, a sudden explosion of genius. But was it really new? Or was it the moment when lost inventions, hidden for centuries, finally resurfaced? Maybe the Dark Ages weren't dark at all. Maybe they were dimly lit corridors, where knowledge survived in secret rooms, waiting for its time to return. And that's the unsettling thought. Because if history can erase inventions so advanced they shouldn't exist, what else has been lost? What else lies buried, quietly proving that the story we call progress isn't a straight line, but a circle? The truth is, the ignorance of the Dark Ages may be the greatest myth of all. The machines were real. The minds were ready. They were just written out of the script. Deep beneath the heart of Vatican City lies one of the most secretive collections on Earth. Hidden behind reinforced doors, guarded by Swiss soldiers and silence, is a place few have ever seen: the Vatican Apostolic Archive. It's said to stretch over 50 kilometers of shelves, buried below the surface of the world's smallest nation. Thousands of years of documents, letters, scrolls and books, the written memory of Western civilization, all stored in the dim light of eternal secrecy. Only a handful of scholars are granted access each year. Even then, they can request only specific documents, one at a time, and they're watched every second they read. The rest of the collection remains untouched, unseen, unread. So, what exactly lies down there? Officially, the archive, once known as the Archivum Secretum Vaticanum, contains records of church governance, papal correspondence, and centuries of history. But secretum doesn't mean secret, it means private. That's the Church's explanation. Yet the name alone, the mystery of it, has inspired centuries of speculation. Imagine walking those halls. Endless corridors lined with parchment and leather, the air heavy with the scent of time. Each shelf stacked with the voices of the past. Emperors, scientists, kings, explorers, even heretics, all preserved under lock and key. The whispers of entire civilizations, written in ink and sealed away. Historians believe the archive holds documents that could reshape what we know about the world. Letters between Michelangelo and the popes, the trial transcripts of Galileo, forced to deny his belief that the earth moves around the sun, the orders that launched the Crusades, the papers from the Inquisition, and diplomatic secrets that once decided the fate of empires. But then come the rumors, the things no one can prove. Some say within those shelves lie maps of lands erased. From memory, accounts of civilizations lost before the flood, even texts from the Library of Alexandria that were smuggled to Rome before it burned. Others claim the Church preserves forbidden knowledge, manuscripts on ancient technologies, early experiments in science and alchemy, and writings that contradict the very foundation of doctrine. And somewhere among the endless stacks, perhaps, are the missing Gospels, those that tell a different story of Christ, one where knowledge and divinity belong to all, not just the chosen few. Of course, the Vatican denies the existence of such secrets. They insist it's all just history, organized, preserved, protected. Yet if truth is light, why is so much of it kept underground? It's easy to wonder what would happen if those shelves were open to the world. How many mysteries could be solved? How many questions answered? How many beliefs would be shaken? Because knowledge, once revealed, cannot be controlled. And maybe that's the real reason the vaults stay closed, not to hide evil, but to maintain order. Still, the thought lingers. Beneath the gold and marble of St. Peter's Basilica, beneath the prayers and the power, lies a world of paper, a world that remembers everything. And in that silence, those words wait, not lost, not forgotten, just unread. Long before the Bible took its final form, hundreds of writings claimed to tell the story of Christ. Different voices, different memories, letters, parables, and teachings passed from hand to hand across the ancient world. But when the Church decided what would become Scripture, most of those voices were silenced. They became known as the Gnostic Gospels, texts that spoke of knowledge, not obedience, insight, not authority. And among them were some of the most remarkable writings ever discovered: the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, and the Gospel of Judas. For centuries, these books were thought to be destroyed. Then, in 1945, a group of farmers digging near Nag Hammadi, Egypt, unearthed a sealed jar filled with ancient papyrus scrolls. When scholars began translating them, history shifted. Inside were words that had been hidden for nearly 1,600 years, words that told a very different story. The Gospel of Thomas didn't describe miracles or prophecy. Instead, it recorded sayings, teachings attributed directly to Jesus. But these weren't commands from above. They were riddles about awakening something within. "The kingdom of God is inside you," one line reads, "and it is outside you." To find divinity, you didn't need a priest, a temple, or even a savior. You needed awareness, self-realization. The Gospel of Mary, believed to have been written by Mary Magdalene, went further. It portrayed her not as a sinner, but as a leader, a disciple who understood Christ's teachings more deeply than the others. It spoke of inner visions, of enlightenment through understanding, not worship. For the early church, such ideas were dangerous. If salvation came from within, then authority from above began to crumble. And then came the Gospel of Judas, discovered decades later in a cave in Egypt. In it, Judas isn't a traitor. He's the one disciple who truly understood Jesus' plan. Betrayal becomes a misunderstood act of faith. The story flips completely. These writings weren't just alternative versions of Christianity. They were a challenge to the structure of power itself. They suggested that truth didn't need to be mediated through institutions, that each person could find God through knowledge, reflection, and awareness. That was the heart of Gnosticism, the belief that divine truth is found through gnosis or personal insight. It taught that enlightenment wasn't granted by priests or rituals, but discovered through inner awakening. For a growing institution built on hierarchy and control, that was unacceptable. If people believed they didn't need an intermediary to reach the divine, the Church's authority would weaken. So the Gnostic texts were branded heretical. Their followers were hunted, their writings destroyed. What survived was buried, sealed away in jars and forgotten, until the sands of Egypt gave them back. Today, those forbidden Gospels offer a haunting glimpse of what might have been. A faith built not on fear or obedience, but on understanding and self-knowledge. They remind us that truth is never one voice. It's a chorus, and when some voices are silenced, the song becomes incomplete. Maybe that was their true crime, not defying God, but defying permission. Because once you teach that light exists within everyone, no one can truly rule it again. Not every prison is made of stone. Some are built of words, and the strongest ones are written in faith. After centuries of silence, the Church's power had grown far beyond the pulpit. It wasn't just the keeper of souls anymore. It had become the gatekeeper of knowledge. What people learned, what they believed, even what they could imagine, all of it flowed through a single filter. And so began an age when ignorance wasn't accidental, it was engineered. Education no longer meant discovery, it meant devotion. The purpose of learning shifted from understanding the world to defending doctrine. Schools were replaced with monasteries, scholars became theologians, the curious became cautious. Children grew up learning not how to think, but what to think. The stars were no longer mysteries to study. They were symbols to fear. The earth was the unmoving center of creation. To question it was to question God himself. And yet, the human mind doesn't stop wondering just because it's told to. So curiosity was recast as rebellion, a temptation, a sin. To seek knowledge outside the Church's boundaries was to risk your soul. For centuries, that warning was enough. This was the genius of engineered ignorance. No need for chains when people police their own thoughts. Those who dared to push further paid the price. Philosophers who spoke of an infinite universe, scientists who questioned scripture, Even healers who practiced medicine based on observation, all were silenced. The Inquisition made sure of it. Heresy became a crime not of action, but of imagination. But the system didn't rely on fear alone. It relied on comfort. Faith gave people structure, certainty, and belonging. The world made sense when every answer led back to God. Ignorance became sacred because it was safe. It spared people from the burden of doubt. And so, generation after generation, minds grew smaller. Alt weaker, but narrower. Curiosity, once the fire that built civilizations, became a flicker no one dared to fan. People learned to kneel before mystery instead of exploring it. The unknown wasn't an invitation anymore. It was a warning. Meanwhile, in the East, scholars mapped the stars, perfected algebra, and preserved ancient philosophy. Europe looked inward, convinced that the only truth worth knowing was already written in holy books. The Renaissance would one day shatter that illusion, but for nearly 1,000 years, the West lived in a carefully constructed illusion, a world where questioning was sin and obedience was salvation. And maybe that's the most dangerous kind of darkness, the one you believe is light. Because when you convince people that not knowing is holy, you never have to silence them again. They do it themselves. The age of engineered ignorance wasn't just about hiding knowledge. It was about reshaping the human spirit, teaching people to find comfort in limitation, to see safety in blindness, to believe that the boundaries of faith were the boundaries of truth. It worked. For centuries, the world stayed quiet. But deep down, under that silence, something else was growing, the memory of curiosity itself. And once that memory returns, no wall of belief can hold it back forever. After centuries of silence, Europe suddenly began to speak again. Painters, scientists, and thinkers emerged as if waking from a deep sleep. Cathedrals rose higher, books multiplied, and art exploded with color and imagination. Historians would later call it the Renaissance, the rebirth of human knowledge. But what if it wasn't a rebirth at all? What if the light that returned was never truly gone, just hidden behind locked doors, waiting for someone to open them? It began in the 14th century, when trade and travel brought forgotten manuscripts back to Europe. Scholars in Italy, France, and Spain started encountering ideas that felt both ancient and new. Texts from Greece, Rome, and the Arab world. Works of Aristotle, Plato, and Euclid resurfaced. Medicine, mathematics, and astronomy returned to the conversation. It was as if Europe had suddenly remembered it once knew more than it believed. But here's the truth most history books skip over. These ideas didn't reappear by miracle. They came through translation, from Arabic, Persian, and Hebrew manuscripts preserved by scholars in the East. While Europe prayed in silence, the Islamic world had been protecting, studying, and expanding the wisdom of the ancients. Libraries in Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo had held the knowledge Europe thought it had lost. So when those texts returned, Europe wasn't discovering. It was rediscovering. Thinkers like Leonardo da Vinci and Copernicus became icons of genius, but their ideas didn't come from nowhere. The Renaissance wasn't an explosion of new creation. It was an unsealing. The result of centuries of preservation, finally allowed to breathe again. And that's where the story turns curious. If this knowledge had survived elsewhere all along, who chose to keep it from Europe for so long? The Church had long guarded its libraries, its archives, and its interpretation of truth. As trade grew and books began spreading beyond monasteries, control started to slip. The printing press, invented by Gutenberg in the mid-15th century, changed everything. For the first time, knowledge could travel faster than authority could stop it. The light was leaking out, page by page. Painters captured anatomy and motion. Mathematicians described the stars. Explorers mapped the edges of the world. Humanity's curiosity had been reignited, or perhaps finally freed. Yet the deeper question remains: if the Renaissance was a rebirth, who had been keeping humanity asleep? Every rediscovery of the period, from ancient geometry to surgical techniques to planetary motion, hinted that someone, somewhere, had always known. The so-called dark centuries might not have been dark at all, just censored, controlled, and renamed. When Europe celebrated its awakening, it was really celebrating access to truths that had always existed. The Renaissance wasn't the birth of knowledge, it was the escape of knowledge. And perhaps that's why it felt like light flooding a locked room. Sudden, blinding, unstoppable. But even then, not every door was opened. Some remained closed, deep beneath the same institutions that had kept them sealed for centuries. So maybe the Renaissance wasn't a rebirth. It was a leak. A moment when the walls cracked just enough for light to slip through. And humanity, dazed and amazed, called it discovery. What if the timeline we live by isn't the truth, but an arrangement? A story woven from fragments, edited, stitched, and polished until it feels seamless. We like to think of time as a straight line, one event following another, leading neatly to now. But history rarely moves in straight lines. It bends, it folds, and sometimes it's rewritten. If 3 centuries never truly happened, if the phantom time theory holds even a grain of truth, then time itself isn't a measure. It's a design. The idea is almost unthinkable. But then again, so is the fact that our calendar has already been changed, adjusted, and redefined more than once. Caesar did it. The popes did it. Scientists did it again centuries later. Every correction to fix time has rewritten the way we perceive it. So, if time can be corrected, can it also be created? Imagine a thread pulled from a vast tapestry, a few centuries quietly added, a few names rearranged. Would we ever notice? Most of us know history not through experience but through stories, the ones we're told, the ones written by those who lived long enough to record them. But memory is fragile. It can be reshaped, edited, even replaced. If the maps we've seen show continents drawn long before their discovery, if records speak of lost civilizations erased from textbooks, if archives deep beneath the Vatican still guard pages that contradict the accepted timeline, then what exactly are we standing on? A record of events, or a rehearsal of belief? Time, after all, isn't just clocks and calendars. It's context. It's how we define who we are and where we've been. Alter the timeline, and you alter identity. A single misplaced century changes cause and effect, turns history's heroes into myths and myths into facts. Maybe that's why those who control the record of time wield more power than kings. Because if you can write the past, you can sharp the future. Think of how we mark our place in history. BC and AD. Before and after a single moment. That division isn't cosmic, it's human. A decision, a line drawn by belief. Every age is defined this way, by what we decide to remember and what we allow to fade. But time doesn't care about our divisions. The stars don't follow our calendars. The earth spins to no man's schedule. In the grand scale of the universe, centuries are nothing more than scratches in the dust. And yet those scratches define everything we know. Our wars, our discoveries, our ancestors, even our destiny. So what if those scratches were moved, shifted slightly forward or back? Would we even know what we'd lost? Maybe the truth is that time isn't something we move through. It's something we build. A human creation. A fragile fabric woven from belief and memory. And just like any fabric, it can tear. It can be patched. It can be remade. History, then, isn't the record of what happened. It's the memory of what survived. And if the keepers of that memory ever decide to change the story, how would we know? Because time is only real as long as we agree on it. And maybe, just maybe, we've been agreeing to the wrong version all along. Every story we've told so far leads here, not to darkness, but to light. The kind of light so bright it blinds instead of reveals. We've been taught that truth hides in shadows, locked away in vaults and secret archives. But maybe that's only part of the story. Maybe the greatest secrets aren't buried in the dark at all. Maybe they sit in plain sight, hidden by the brightness of the world we think we already understand. For centuries, humanity has searched for truth in forgotten ruins, forbidden texts, and lost timelines. We've imagined conspiracies, erased centuries, and vanished civilizations. Yet beneath all those questions lies one that cuts deeper. Why did we stop looking? Because truth doesn't vanish. It waits. It sleeps beneath layers of comfort, under stories repeated so many times they become unquestionable. The past isn't gone. It's just buried beneath what we want to believe. Look around. The cathedrals that rise toward heaven, the paintings that depict divine perfection, the history books that tell us who we are. They all shine with authority, confidence, and light. But light can deceive. It draws the eye away from the edges, from the shadows where questions still linger. Every civilization has done it. Egypt, Rome, Byzantium, even our own. We build monuments to certainty, and in doing so, we quietly erase the things that don't fit. The inconvenient truths, the missing pages, the voices that whispered a little too loudly. It's easier to live in the glow of answers than in the discomfort of questions. That's how ignorance survives, not as darkness, but as brilliance, the illusion that we already know enough. Maybe that's why history feels rehearsed, the same rise, the same fall, the same redemption. Every age tells its story as if it's the first to find the light, forgetting the ones that came before. We repeat the same myths, the same patterns, calling it progress when it's really memory looping back on itself. And somewhere, beneath all that repetition, the real story lies. Quiet, patient, waiting for someone brave enough to dig again. The truth isn't lost in some ancient vault. It's in the questions we no longer ask. It's in the knowledge we dismiss as myth. It's in the patterns we refuse to see, because they don't match our idea of how history should look. Maybe the Dark Ages weren't dark, the Renaissance wasn't new, and time itself isn't what we think. Maybe what we call history is just the version of truth we were willing to accept. But here's the hope hidden inside all of it. The moment we start asking again, the shadows start to speak. Because the human story has never really been about what we know. It's about what we're still willing to search for. So as this journey ends, remember, every era calls itself enlightened. Every generation believes it's finally found the truth. But the real light, the kind that reveals, not blinds, only comes to those who keep looking. History's greatest cover-up may not be in the past at all. It may be in us, in our comfort, our certainty, our silence. And somewhere, beneath that bright, blinding light, we call truth. The shadows still whisper. And so maybe history's greatest mystery isn't buried in the ruins of Rome or sealed beneath the Vatican. Maybe it's right here, in our memory. Because truth doesn't disappear. It waits. It hides behind the stories we stop questioning, and the facts we never think to challenge. Every page of history whispers the same message. Look closer. Because the moment we stop searching, the shadows win. This was Mysteries of Earth, where the past still speaks, and every answer begins with a question. If you enjoyed this journey through the forgotten ages, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because the next mystery is already waiting.